Okay, the bell has rung, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is the last class of our quarter. I appreciate all of your discussion and your thoughts and all your all your input. This quarter has been really helpful. This has been a great study, I think, diving into Joshua and his character and the events that the Israelites went through and how we can actually apply that to our lives today. It is July, so we have a new memory verse for the month. So, if I can turn this on. Let's go ahead and recite this together. Ezra 7:10. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. Okay, so this is it. We're going to wrap up the book tonight. We've been looking, if you'll remember, previous to VBS, we were talking about how after the settlements, the Israelites had been dismissed to their tribes. They went and settled. There were some disagreements between the eastern tribes and the western tribes, some issues. The western tribes were concerned that they were going to lose the promise that they'd been given. They were going to lose access to their land because of what they perceived as the sins of the eastern tribe. We're going to wrap up the study with looking at additional things that Joshua communicates here in the latter days of his life about following God and the requirements, the conditions for them to continue to live in the land here. So let's go ahead and start reading Joshua 23. There's really two big speeches he gives here. I want to read them as a whole rather than divide them up. As he would have communicated them, he wouldn't have stopped in the middle of it. So I kind of wanted to just read it as a clump, and then we can have lots of discussion about those things. So Joshua 23, beginning in verse 1. Now it came to pass, a long time after the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua was old, advanced in age. And Joshua called for all Israel, for their elders, for their heads, for their judges, for their officers, and said to them, I am old, advanced in years. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he who has fought for you. See, I have divided to you by lot these nations that remain, to be inheritance for your tribes, from the Jordan, with all the nations that I have cut off, as far as the great sea westward. And the Lord your God will expel them from before you, and drive them out of your sight. So you shall possess their land, as the Lord your God promised you. Therefore, be very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, lest you turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left. And lest you go among these nations, these who remain among you, you shall not make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause anyone to swear by them. You shall not serve them, nor bow down to them. But you shall hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out from before you great and strong nations. But as for you, no one has been able to stand against you to this day. 1 man of you shall chase 1,000, for the Lord your God is he who fights for you, as he promised you. Therefore, take careful heed to yourselves, that you love the Lord your God, or else, if indeed you do go back and cling to the remnant of these nations, these that remain among you, and make marriages with them, and go in to them, and they to you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps to you, and scourges on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Behold, this day I am going the way of the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one thing has failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spoke concerning you, all that came to pass for you, not one word of them has failed. Therefore it shall come to pass that as all the good things have come upon you which the Lord your God promised you, so the Lord will bring upon you all harmful things, until he has destroyed you from this good land which the Lord your God has given you, when you have transgressed the commandments of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods and bowed down to them, and the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land which he has given you. Okay, so Joshua here is talking to a group of people. Who is he talking with in this chapter?
For
Yes, so he's calling for the leaders of the land. He's calling them. We don't know exactly where he's calling them to. Chapter 24 is specific as to that speech, but this one we don't really know. There's some indication, because we know where Joshua lived, that he could be calling them to him where he lives, which was in Timnath-Serah, which was in the mountains of Ephraim, located here on this map. Again, that's just speculation. We don't really know, and really it's not very important. What's important is the significance of the event. Why did Joshua do this?
Close to death.
Okay, so he's about to die. He's old. He's advanced in years, which it says here. JD?
And even after all this time, he's still looking out for his people, as any leader should, making sure that they stay on the right track, making the right choices, that their leaders make the right choices. Because he spent this whole time leading, that he doesn't want them to just go straight, and then he's in the dirt, so to speak.
Right. So he's about to die, and he's taken the opportunity to call the leaders before him and communicate some last words of wisdom. Try to keep them on the straight and narrow path. Stephen?
And he's really wanting them to make that a commitment for themselves. He won't be there to remind them anymore. And so he's really calling upon them to pick up the torch and say, look, you saw what he did. You know what God is doing for you. You know what he's doing. Be courageous and stand up and follow him.
Yeah, he's taking the opportunity to give them some last words of encouragement. Have we seen this before? Do we see this in other places in the Bible?
Moses, Samuel.
Moses did it throughout all of Deuteronomy, right? Samuel did it. What? David. What about the New Testament? Paul, with the elders of Miletus. Yep. Jesus did it, and when they were praying in the garden, and when they were at the Last Supper, right? We see Peter doing it in 2 Peter 1. He's about to die, and he talks about how he's about to lay out this tent, but he's going to take this opportunity to remind the people he's writing to of some certain things. So this is something we see, and hopefully we see in life too. When people are moving on and getting ready to die, they take opportunities to encourage. Don't waste any moment that we have with people to encourage them and give them words of wisdom for sure. So what did he charge them to do? Stephen mentioned a couple of things already. What did he charge them with?
Not mix with the other nations.
Yep, so there's a lot of warning here to remain faithful to God and refrain from mixing with the other nations. It's going to take some courage to do that, right? You're going to be surrounded by these nations. Ideally, they push them out, but we know that didn't happen. And so they needed to stand fast, even amongst those who are among them. I found the phrasing in verse 7 interesting here. You shall not make mention of the name of their gods. Forget about them. Don't even talk about it. When I read that, I thought of Ephesians 5:12, for it is shameful to even speak of the things that they do in secret. Don't even talk about their gods. Don't communicate that. Keep your focus on God and God only. These things are shameful, and you don't want to have anything to do with those things. It's really an interesting thing. Sometimes we can get kind of frivolous talking about sin sometimes as if it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. And we need to keep as far away from it as possible. Abhor what is evil, as it talks about in Romans 12. Great. So keep away from the other gods and all the people of the nations around them. What else?
Saul kind of wrapped up in calls to remember what God's done. You've seen God do this, you've seen him do that, now go do this other thing.
Yeah, so the call to stay away from the other nations is really in response to God's promises that he has fulfilled to them thus far. He starts out with, you've seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you, and talking about all the promises that have been fulfilled. Therefore, you need to have a response to him. Keep away from sin. Keep away from the other nations. Reject them as God has rejected them too. Follow his lead because he is their leader. Great. Anything else? What's the warning here that's given if they do fall to the entrapments of the other nations?
God will destroy them from the land.
Yeah, God's going to put them out from the land. There are promises that God has given. Verse 15, just as surely as all those good promises have come to pass, so will all the curses that he promised them too. That if they fail to follow him, if they fail to push out the remnants of the land, if they fail to stay separate, God's going to bring those promises true as well. And they're not good things that they're going to want. They're not good things that they're going to enjoy. Good or bad, God keeps all his promises at all times. He's just as prompt to fulfill those negative things to those who violate his law as he is to carry out the blessings for those who fulfill them. What can we learn from this?
He kind of, without maybe saying it this bluntly, he basically says, you want God on your good side. And I like for example, verse 10, one man of you puts to 5,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you just as he promised. Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. But then in verse 16, he said, if you serve these other gods, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you will perish quickly. So it's like they've seen what God's wrath can do, and so it seems like Joshua's warning them, like, you've seen what it's like to execute that wrath. You don't want that wrath executed against you. And so I feel like that's a good reminder. I mean, when we talk about Judgment Day, it's like, which side are you going to be on? And that's really strong reminder.
It is. Peter talked about it in 2 Peter 3, right? The sin of the world brought about the flood. There has been destruction and judgment brought upon the earth before. Same thing here. It's been brought upon these nations in response to their wickedness and sin. No one's going to escape judgment at some point. Which side of the line are we going to fall on? Are we going to be part of God's people, separate, holy nation, or are we going to be tempted and led astray by those around us? It's the same decision that comes down to us too. Yeah, great. Anybody else? Soon.
If we allow evil influences into our lives and welcome those in, it will have a devastating effect eventually.
Yeah, every time. Judges and the days of the kings were full of examples of the potential of sin in our lives if we just give it a foothold. Don't even name these gods. Don't start down that path, because once you do, it's all consuming and it could be a real problem. Yeah.
Verse 8, it says, but you are to cling to the Lord your God. And then down in verse 12, but if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, et cetera, you can't straddle the fence, right? You have to pick a side, and you're going to cling to it. So, same for us today. You can't serve God and Mammon, right? You've got to pick a side, cling to it.
Yep, that echoes the choice he's going to give them in chapter 24, right? Choose this day who you're going to serve. Everyone's going to serve somebody. A decision to not follow God is a decision to follow the world, follow after sin. And you're going to choose one direction or the other. Be sure you're making the right choice. Cling to what's good, or else you're clinging to the other. Yeah, great. Anybody else before we move on to chapter 24? Ryan.
I've been thinking recently about, I guess, aging with dignity, with maybe with some family members and things, but I know that can be extremely difficult, especially when you're, in this case, well advanced in years. Your body is giving out. You're dying, essentially. What good are you from a carnal, earthly perspective? You're not able to work. You're not able to. You don't have the same mental faculties. Whatever it might be. But at the same time, the older women and older men in the New Testament are told to exhort the young men and the young women and be the example. And I think here in verse 14, behold, this day I'm going the way of all the earth. It's something we're all going to go with. And you know that in your hearts and all your souls, that not one thing has failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spoke concerning it. What I would want as maybe more of a younger man on that spectrum is when I'm around an older person to constantly be exhorted that though they might not have a job or be able to provide for their family anymore, whatever it is, it's even they're in the playoffs of life. It's even better. They have the perspective that they're going to meet God soon, and so therefore they need to be exhorting me to not be pulled away from God and to serve God, because I'm going their way, the way of all mankind. And so I don't know. I see this and I think, okay, this is how. When I'm on my deathbed, I hope to God that I'm able to say these things to my children.
Yeah, we are all going to be at this point someday, maybe sooner than others. Everybody has a different span, right? And you're right. We all serve a purpose. It doesn't matter how young, how old. Everybody has a job. We don't see Joshua here retiring from this. He's out there doing what he can right up until the end to warn and exhort and encourage everyone. Hopefully we can all do that. Sometimes I think, I used to work in the adult world of therapy, and I would work with older adults who were dying sometimes, and they couldn't dress themselves. They couldn't get out of bed by themselves, and they considered themselves useless. No one's useless to God. Everybody can do something, and we all need to be looking for what that thing is. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Anybody else? Okay, let's go on to chapter 24. There's a lot of meat in this chapter, some repetition from chapter 23, and I want to kind of tackle some of these things before the end of our class. Chapter 24, verse 1. Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elders of Israel, for their heads, for their judges, and for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river, and led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants, and gave him Isaac. To Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. To Esau I gave the mountains of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. Also I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt, according to what I had done among them. Afterward I brought you out. Then I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. So they cried out to the Lord, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, brought the sea upon them, and covered them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt. Then you dwelt in the wilderness a long time. And I brought you into the land of the Amorites, who dwelt on the other side of the Jordan. And they fought with you, but I gave them into your hands, that you might possess their land, and I destroyed them from before you. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose to make war against Israel, and sent and called Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. But I would not listen to Balaam. Therefore he continued to bless you. So I delivered you out of his hand. Then you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho, and the men of Jericho fought against you. Also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. But I delivered them into your hand. I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out from before you. Also the 2 kings of the Amorites, but not with your sword or with your bow. I have given you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you did not build, and you dwell in them, and you eat of the vineyards and the olive groves which you did not plant. Now therefore, fear the Lord. Serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which you served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. But if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which are on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So the people answered and said, Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God is he who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, who did these great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the ways that we went, and among all the people through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out from before us all the people, including the Amorites who dwelt in the land. We also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. But Joshua said to the people, You cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions nor your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you, after he has done you good. But the people said to Joshua, No, but we will serve the Lord. So Joshua said to the people, You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord for yourself, to serve him. And they said, We are witnesses. Now therefore, he said, Put away the foreign gods which are among you, and incline your heart to the Lord God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, The Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and made for them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. Then Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up underneath the oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, Behold, this stone shall be a witness to us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord which he spoke to us. It shall therefore be a witness to you, lest you deny your God. So Joshua let the people depart, each to his own inheritance. So Joshua calls the people here to come together. And where was this that he met with them? Shechem. Yep. Shechem is in the tribe of Western Manasseh, between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, just on the boundary between Manasseh and Ephraim here. This is modern-day Shechem, located between Mount Gerizim and Ebal. What is the significance of this location? Blessings and cursings. So we read about that in Joshua 8, that they had been there before. This was where they renewed the covenant with God after the defeat and then subsequent victory at Ai. The renewal to follow after God after the Achan had strayed and sinned. What else?
Abraham was there at one time.
Yep. So this is of great importance to Israel. Abraham was there. This is where God showed Abraham the promised land, was from the land of Shechem, or the region of Shechem. Said, this is what your people are going to inherit one day. What else? What about Jacob? In Genesis 33, Jacob erected an altar here. This is where he praised God. The altar was called El Elohe Israel, which means God, the God of Israel, after he reunited with Esau in Genesis 33. And then what did he do shortly thereafter in Genesis 35? And this is the important thing, I think, at least to me. In verses 1 through 4 in Genesis 35, Jacob called to put away the foreign gods of his wives. And he gathered them up while they went ahead, and he buried them at Shechem. Jacob took the foreign gods from his wives, and he put them away. He made a dedication for his house to follow after God and God only, and not the gods that his wives served in the land to the north where they had come from. I think this is a key point for the people here, and is the point of Joshua here as well. Put away the gods of the past and serve God only. This is what he's calling them to do. I asked the question in the book, what is Joshua's purpose in reciting the history of the Israelites? This is really an incorrect question. What is God's purpose in reciting the history? Because this is the word of God that he's communicating first initially. JD.
Just a reminder of you, just God letting the people know that I did all this for you and all of this to your enemies. So do not, and I'm telling you this again, so that you are not deceived into thinking that I will not do the same to you should you turn your back against me.
So he's taking the moment here to remind them of the blessings that God has given him from the beginning of the nation of Israel. He's talking about, their forefathers going all the way back to Terah in the land of Ur worshipped idols. And God called them to do something better, to do something different. He pulled Abraham from that, brought him to the land of Canaan. He gave them the son of promise, Isaac. That promise was passed down to Jacob. They went into bondage, but they were brought out by the salvation of God through Moses and Aaron and the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea. He provided for them in the wilderness food and protection from the Amorites and salvation from Balak, king of Moab. He brought them into the promised land. He saved them. He delivered them, not because of their own strength, their own swords and bows, but because of his strength. 21 times in this passage, in these passages, from verse 2 all the way down to verse 13. 21 times God says, I took, I gave, or I did, or some variation of that, to reference the things that he did for his people. God has given them everything. Nothing that they had came about by their own strength or their own power. Everything came from God. And Joshua here is taking the moment to remind them of their position before God and what God has done for them. It's reminded them of the fulfilled promises. These are not just things that happened, right? This has been planning on God's part for centuries. Certainly in the planning stages, right? We're at the point here where we're talking about hundreds of years between Abraham receiving the promise and now they are in the land itself and been given it. And so God has taken this moment to remind them. And really, he then calls them to make a choice in response to the promises, in response to the blessings that you've been given. What are you going to do with it? And so what's the choice that Joshua calls for them? Matthew.
Another reason for reciting that is whenever there's a covenant that they make or establish, the first thing is they establish the relationship between the parties. And so that's what God's doing here. This is my relationship to you.
Yes, God is reestablishing that covenant to them. Excellent point. Yes, covenant takes two people. It takes both parties doing something, right? God is giving us these promises, these blessings. What are the people going to do in response to that covenant blessing? So what is the call that Joshua makes here to the people? Miles.
When you look at how he recites the history, it's almost like he goes through different gods, like false gods, all these nations that he's basically left in his way. And so then he's like, I beat this one, I beat this one, I beat this one, I beat this one. Who are you going to pick?
Yeah.
Like me or all the ones I've destroyed? And so I feel like that's kind of how he builds up to his point.
It's an excellent point. God has a perfect track record, right? There's not been a single thing that God has lost to when he's been battling against the sin and the idolatry of the world, right? And so when you have a choice to serve, who are you going to choose? It's the same thing that we talked about in the last chapter in 23. Are you going to serve the gods on the other side of the river? This is the side of Euphrates. Are you going to serve the gods of the Egyptians? Are you going to serve the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell? Make a choice. There's no riding the fence, as Lori talked about. You're going to choose one side or you're going to choose the other. Which side is it going to be? Yeah. Comments? Is this the same choice that we have today? Yeah. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says you can't serve two masters. We all have to make a choice. Even if we think we're putting off a choice, or we're delaying or dragging our feet, we're making a choice. We're making a choice not to make the right choice in that moment, right? God is, let me ask this question. So it says here in verse 19, Joshua said to the people, you can't serve the Lord, for he's a holy God. He's a jealous God. What does Joshua mean by that? They make the choice in verse 18, and then Joshua says, hold on, you can't do that. What does he mean by it when he says that?
it's gonna require a change, but they have to put away the false gods. So it's gonna require action on their part. It's not just, you can't just say it, I think is his point.
I agree with that. I think there's some implication here that they have not fully dedicated themselves to God. This has been chapter 23, verse 1. Now it came to pass a long time after the Lord gave them rest, right? What should have they been doing in those intervening years? Working. Pushing out the Canaanites. They haven't been doing that.
I read that verse in chapter 24, verse 17, as almost them making an excuse for themselves. Hey, we're not going to forsake the Lord. And he preserved us in the way we went in and went out among all these people. We've kind of been doing this. It's been working out okay, and God's taking care of us. And he comes back and says, no, you can't live that way. You can't keep one foot here and one foot there. You can't play around with the people in the land. You have to serve me and only me. And that's the way I see it.
Yes, they hadn't fully made the choice for themselves yet. We talk a lot of times about how with our kids, they have to develop their own faith. That's kind of what Josh was calling them to do here. Develop your own faith. They've been following leaders in front of them. They've been following Moses. They've been following Joshua, who they can physically see. Joshua's about to die. This is a period of transition here where they have to stand up on their own feet and push those people out. They have to work on their own faith. And they can't just do lip service. And they can't do it halfway. God's calling them to action. Yeah, great point. Anybody else have a thought about this passage? What are going to be the implications if Israel chose to continue worshiping idols?
In summary, they'd be doomed.
Yep. So in verse 19, that forgiveness of sins, God's not going to wink at their sins, right? If they are choosing to sin, he is going to allow them to do that, but there will be consequences of those sins, which would be that all the harm that has been promised, those cursings that have been promised. Remember, let's go back to that picture. We'll get there. There we go. Whoops, too far. So, they are here in the center, blessings and cursings. They see it. They were just there, a number of years before, but these people are still alive. They can remember this event. They remember the sin that preceded it and the judgment that fell upon them at Ai. There's a promise here of blessing, but there's also a promise of cursing if they fail to do what they're supposed to do. And that promise will come true, just as it did at Ai. For sure it will come to pass also if they fail to follow after God at this point. Unfortunately, we know the end of that story, right? They served him for a while until the generation that was with Joshua and after Joshua died out. And then they fell to this cycle of sin and being brought into bondage of the nations around them because they failed. Let me try to get back where we were. Yes. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments on this section of 24?
Just thinking about how in verse 14 he says, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and truth. So immediately your mind goes to the New Testament, right? And you think John 4:24, those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Later in chapter 24, he says in verse 23, put away the foreign gods, but also incline your hearts to the Lord. So he's asking for both hearts. They can't just put away the foreign gods. They have to be sincere and incline their heart to God. And God's always asked that of his people, even to this day. We can't just do all the actions and not have the heart part, or have the right heart and not have the actions behind it.
Yeah, we have the same. We can't just be Sunday Christians, right? It's got to be every day. It's got to be an active choice in every moment, at every decision, every day. We've got to get up and we've got to incline our heart, like you said. The greatest command, love the Lord your God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? It requires dedication, but it requires seek first the kingdom of God. Do all these things to follow him first. He's got to be the priority. Because if he's not, that is where we slip up. If we fail to put him above everything else, we're going to be worshiping idols too. It may not be a physical God, but we're putting things in front of him in a place that it shouldn't be, and making that our priority. And we're going to have the same cursings that fall upon us too, if we're not really careful. Yeah, great point. Anybody else? Okay. So it's a call to action here. And so Joshua here calls them to action. They respond in kind. This is a response to all the promises that have been fulfilled. And he renews the covenant with them in the same place where he had years before. And they departed each to their own inheritance. Let's go on to the rest of the book. Now it came to pass after these things, this is verse 29, that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him within the border of his inheritance at Timnath-Serah, which is in the mountains of Ephraim, on the north side of Mount Gash. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had known all the works of the Lord which he had done for Israel. And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt, they buried at Shechem, in the plot of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, which had become an inheritance of the children of Joseph. And Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died. They buried him in a hill belonging to Phinehas, his son, which was given to him in the mountains of Ephraim. Okay, so we see here really a conclusion of really these first 6 books. We see, certainly from Exodus on, is dominated by Moses and Aaron leading the people. And then we have Joshua stepping up in the absence of Moses, ordained by God, to lead the people here. And now we're ending that point here, and we're transitioning to a tribal leadership after the death of Jacob. I found interesting, talking about promises fulfilled, verse 32, the bones of Joseph, after almost 500 years, are now being laid to rest, following the promise that was given to Joseph at that point too. And so you have the death of of Joshua here, at a ripe old age of 110, and being spoken of as the servant of the Lord. What is the legacy of Joshua? How would you describe that?
I would describe it as legacy of a man who did what was brave rather than what was easy.
Yeah. His leading people, we've talked about this, leading a people of a nomadic people who were not warriors against professional warriors, for lack of a better term, in fortified cities that they shouldn't have been able to beat would have been hard. But he did it. He stepped up to the challenge, and he did the best he could, and he followed faithfully. Yeah.
I think Joshua 24:31 is Joshua's legacy.
Okay.
People serve the Lord all the days of Joshua, all the days of the elders that lived Joshua. To me, Joshua and Judges are such contrasting books. You have, from the time we're introduced to Joshua, you have a man who wants to serve the Lord, does what he wants to, but not only does it for himself, it has an impact on others to serve the Lord. And then you open up the story of the book of Judges, and it just begins with such a contrast of the opposite of the legacy of Joshua. After this, a generation arose that did not know the Lord. So to me, you have this exact same statement in the book at the beginning of the book of Judges, that Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of those that outlived Joshua. And to me, you can't ask for a better legacy than that, regardless of what he did or didn't do. And I think you're right. His military conquests were phenomenal. But the reason his military conquests were phenomenal was because he served and trusted in the Lord, and he got others who were around him to do the same thing. And to me, there's no greater legacy than that. And to me, that one verse pretty much sums up what it is.
Yes, his steadfast example, immovable, always abounding. He was focused. He didn't stray from the path. From the day when they crossed over the Red Sea, he was Moses' assistant. He was following that path. His consistency up until the day that he gave the speeches in 23 and 24. There wasn't a day he wasted. He followed it, and his example, passing down to the elders that lived with him and the elders that saw him and followed his example, is a key legacy. To your point, though, we have talked numerous times in this class about these little memorials they set up so they can remember what happened, remember what God did for them, and so they can talk to their kids about it. And we see at some level there was a failure here, maybe on the part of the elders, maybe the part on the kids, we're not really told. But that example, message, communication, parting remarks, whatever it was, didn't pass along. Not on Joshua's failure, but on the people. And it's a terrible legacy for those people who came after, that the people fell away in that response.
Along to that point, one of the verses from chapter 24 that stands out to me the most is verse 22. And Joshua says to the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him." And they say, "We are witnesses." And like Dan was saying, that is such a devastating verse to read when you know how Judges goes.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of like that passing of the baton, like you said, where it's like, now it's up to y'all. It's like Joshua did the best he could and was a great man, and now it's the next generation's turn.
Right.
And obviously we know how that goes.
Joshua, it appears to me at least, saw his responsibility is to set the next generation up for success. And I think that's our responsibility as parents and people in the church, and older and younger brethren, and wherever we fall on that path, to be doing everything we can to set up the people behind us to be successful and to follow after God and get to heaven too. That baton was dropped somewhere. It wasn't Joshua's, right? He did everything he could to pass it along in honestly a better shape than he received it, right? If you think about the situation of the wanderings and how much they struggled during those 40 years, and Moses set them up in a good place to start out, and then Joshua brought them in and finished that part of the job and passed it on to the next. Yeah, great. Anybody else? Yes.
It's no accident that the name Joshua in Hebrew means Jehovah's salvation, and it's the same root word from which we get Jesus, because it's a type and an antitype. He was leading them through something into salvation.
Yeah, it's a great example for us to kind of have a physical way to view that, how we're being, we're going to be taken into the promised land. And Jesus is the one who's setting the path for us to go that way and follow him. Yeah, excellent point. Anybody else before we wrap up? Okay, thank you all so much for your thoughts and comments, not only tonight, but all quarter. I've really appreciated it. And we'll be starting our new classes on Sunday. If you need books, our books for Sunday are in the back. And I don't think we have a book for Wednesday because we're doing sermon series. So, okay, thank you all.